So welcome and good evening. My name is Samir Gandesha, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. Along with the Institute, this event is being co-sponsored by the J.S. Woodsworth Chair in the Humanities. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge that the event is being hosted on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And what I'd like to do now is really just to introduce the event. I mean, we're absolutely delighted this evening to have the Right Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould to present us with the Grace MacInnis lecture. I just want to say a couple of words about the Grace MacInnis Memorial Lecture, and then introduce Sven Robinson, who will then introduce our most esteemed speaker this evening. So in honor of Grace MacInnis and her history of social and political service as a member of Parliament for the New Democratic Party, a Grace MacInnis Visiting Scholar Program was initiated through the Institute for the Humanities at SFU in 1993. Visiting scholars are invited to SFU to give public talks as well as meet with faculty and students. Ms. MacInnis was the first woman from BC to be elected to Parliament and was the only woman in Parliament between 1968 and 1972. She was appointed as an officer of the Order of Canada in 1974 and was among 7 women to be granted the first Governor General's Persons Award in 1979 for their work in advancing the status of Canadian women, and was honoured in 1982 by the Canadian Labour Congress with a sculpture and an award for outstanding service to humanity. More than awards and medals, Grace MacInnis's true legacy was her unfailing support of human rights issues, particularly women's rights, both in the Canadian Parliament and in her many roles as advocate and activist. As Rosemary Brown once said, and I quote, "She was a very courageous person, and I think that is what women got from her more than anything, that if you felt strongly about something, you should speak up, and you should speak up loud." I'd just like to also mention that previous Grace MacInnis lecturers have been Marie Wilson, Ratna Omidvar, Gail Davidson, Libby Davis, Professor Jean Barman, Linda McQuaig, Dr. Elaine Bernard, Myrna Kostash, Lynn McDonald, Joy Kugawa, and Shirley Williams. Quite a distinguished group and a very fine group to which we add this evening Jody Wilson-Raybould. So now let me just turn to introducing Sven Robinson, a man really who requires no introduction. So Sven Robinson was one of the longest serving federal MPs in BC in British Columbia history, representing the community of Burnaby, which includes Simon Fraser University, with the New Democratic Party for over 25 years, and that's between 1979 and 2004. Since leaving federal politics, he's continued this tradition of public service internationally, and for almost a decade has worked with a global fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, based in Switzerland. From his first election at the age of 27, Sven has charted an important number of firsts. He remains the only MP to be imprisoned for civil disobedience at Clayoquot Sound in 1993, Canada's first openly gay MP. His experiences of standing in solidarity with Cuba and the Palestinian people in the occupied Israeli territory, being adopted into the Haida Nation in 1985, running for the leadership of his party in 1995, and tackling Big Pharma, bring an important perspective that certainly has, over the last year, the last academic year, has really enriched the discussions we've been having at the Institute and beyond, and is also now as the J.S. Woodsworth resident scholar teaching a course in the Department of Humanities. So welcome, Sven. Turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Samir, and good evening. As you mentioned, I have the honor of being the J.S. Woodsworth resident scholar at SFU this year, and it's such an honor to introduce my friend Jody Wilson-Raybould, our 2020 Grace MacInnis visiting scholar. Grace was, of course, the daughter of J.S. Woodsworth and a strong, courageous, and principled social and political activist. And Samir, you've talked about some of her experience as the first BC woman elected to Parliament, and the only woman out of 264 MPs from 68 to 72, serving in the first term of a new Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. And I just want to say that for me, Jody embodies the principles that Grace MacInnis brought to public life: strength, courage, and integrity. Like Grace, Jody's been a visionary trailblazer. Jody graduated from UBC Law School, as did her dad, respected hereditary chief Bill Wilson, another old friend of mine. We worked together closely on the constitutional battles in the early 1980s. And Bill was only the second Indigenous graduate of UBC Law School after Alf Scow, I think it was. We were almost classmates. We missed one another by a couple of years, but an amazing leader as well. Jody went on to serve as a Crown prosecutor in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and has said that experience really helped to shape a lot of her view of justice, particularly around Indigenous justice issues. As a BC Treaty Commissioner, an elected councillor with her home Wai-Kai Council, and forgive me, I'm sure I'm mangling that, BC Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and in 2015, of course, she was elected as a Member of Parliament for Vancouver-Granville. Jody was appointed by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. One of the first women, and of course the first Indigenous person in that key post, in which she played such a key role on a lot of really landmark files. And I don't have the time to go through them because we want to hear from Jody, but it was an incredible term as Attorney General, Minister of Justice. In 2019, after she courageously challenged political interference in the SNC Lavalin prosecution, Jody was re-elected in Vancouver-Granville, but this time as an independent MP. In fact, the first independent to be elected in decades in Canada. We will be able to learn more about her remarkable journey when her memoir, which is entitled Indian in the Cabinet, Speaking Truth to Power, is published, I believe, later this year in the fall. Jody, Puglaas, woman of integrity, the floor is yours.
Oh, Gaelic Hustle, I just unmuted. Thank you, Samir, and thank you, Sven, for that very warm and gracious introduction. And I want to say from the outset, thank you so much to SFU, to the Institute of Humanities, for giving me the opportunity to give the Grace MacInnis lecture this year. It's truly an honor for me to have been asked to do so. And I am sure, like many or everyone listening, appreciate the background about this remarkable woman, Grace MacInnis, remarkable British Columbian and Canadian. And as you said, she is a woman of firsts, including as a member of Parliament from British Columbia. She broke barriers and conventions that were rooted in marginalization and injustice. And she was, as you say, an advocate for human rights. She truly helped pave the way for so many women. Individuals like Grace have inspired me in the many roles that I have played and the choices that I have made in my life, including becoming an MP and then running as an independent in 1999 and becoming, or in 2019, and becoming the first woman ever to be elected in our country's history as an independent member of Parliament. So this evening, I want to share some of my experiences and make some observations about where we are in one of the areas in terms of the struggle for justice that's important to me and I know important to all of you. rights recognition, and true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, why we face so many challenges, and what we must do next in the journey to ensure a more just society. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm speaking on today, acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and also introduce myself. My traditional name is Puglaas. I come from the Musqueam, Sawadenuk, and Liquichta people, part of the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Kwakwala-speaking people. I'm from the Eagle clan. My father, as you said, is Himas Klalilikla Bill Wilson, and my grandmother was Pugledi Ethel Pearson. When I say those words, my name and those from whom I come, one of the things I'm sharing is how in my culture, I was raised and expected to play leadership roles. In my teachings, playing such roles is not a choice. It is about the responsibilities one carries. In my people's worldview, like Indigenous peoples everywhere, we understand everyone has roles to play and responsibilities to fulfill. We all have value. We are all important. And it is by everyone playing their roles and fulfilling their responsibilities that we thrive and progress individually and collectively. In this worldview, there is also a recognition of how we are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent. Like a bird that can't fly with one wing, everyone must play their roles to maintain balance that allows us to continue to move forward and even sometimes soar. In saying that we all have roles to play and responsibilities to fulfill, I'm not suggesting that anything is easy or just happens. Like for all of us in life, where there is something that we know is important, that we feel is of true value, and which in our own ways we're called to do, it takes courage and sacrifice to see it through. In striving to do what we understand is important and valuable, we learn to work to put our best selves forward, to stick our neck out, and to make sure that we're doing everything we can do and that we do it in the best way possible. For me, in all the leadership roles I've played, including as Regional Chief for British Columbia, as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, I've always had my own personal form of assessment of whether I was playing these roles and fulfilling my responsibilities as best I could. Those who are close to me often hear me use these words or hear me say, I need to be able to look myself in the mirror each night. Meaning, I needed to make sure that what I saw reflected back to me was still the person I was raised to be, holding true to the values and teachings that were instilled in me since childhood. For me, a time came when I was serving as Canada's first Indigenous Minister of Justice and Attorney General that I knew, as I looked into the mirror, that I would have to stand up in ways I hoped would never be necessary. But when that time came, I did it, and it was not really a choice. I knew I had to do it. In reading about Grace before this evening, and Samir mentioned this quote, I love the description, so it's worth repeating. She was, somebody speaking of her, she was a very courageous person. And I think that is what women got from her more than anything. That if you felt strongly about something, you should speak up and you should speak loud. Those words give me strength and they resonate greatly. I can only imagine a little bit of what it must have been like for Grace to be the only female MP for that period of time. I can share that today in cabinet, in parliament, and also in Indigenous politics, one continues to experience misogyny and, as an Indigenous person, systemic racism. I have to admit, my experience of this during my time in Ottawa has been, in some ways, more than I anticipated. From the still enduring reality of the same words said by a man rather than a woman being taken more seriously, to use of sexist and racist stereotypes to try to undermine and minimize, to eroding effects of simply having low expectations because one is a woman or Indigenous. All of these were part of the realities of my life as minister. As I described in a speech in 2018 when I was still Minister of Justice, quote, in my experience, serving as the first Indigenous person to be Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I have unfortunately had it reinforced that when addressing Indigenous issues, no matter what table one sits around or in what position or with what title and appearance of influence and power, the experience of marginalization still carries with you, end quote. So let us imagine how much harder it would be for women today if women like Grace were not the first. How much sacrifice and endurance she must have had to deal with it every day. It's bad enough now being in a government that claims it is feminist, its brand today. So what was it like then? I think about how much mistreatment and exclusion she must have dealt with. When I think of Grace, and on a more positive note, it also brings to mind a person who is central to my life and who I am. A person who, totally unbeknownst to me, prepared me more than anyone else for my time as Minister of Justice and everything else that has transpired since. My grandmother, Puglaas. She was a force. Many things my granny experienced feel worlds apart from the reality of my life. And she, like so many others, endured things I can barely imagine. I do not know exactly when my grandmother was born, but we guess it was around 1920. The only records of her birth were destroyed in fires over the years. She was the oldest of 7 kids. At the age of 9, she was sent to residential school with her younger sister, Alice, who was 8. Ultimately, she was kicked out of residential school because she was considered too tough for them to handle. A blessing. But when I think of my grandmother, I do not think of the hardship she endured. Rather, I think of her indomitable spirit and certainty of her role in our culture as a keeper of knowledge, her place in the potlatch, her leadership. It is how she brought our teachings into my life, demonstrated them in her life, and how she guided us, how she played her role to maintain our culture and way of life. I cannot help but think of the words my grandmother spoke about the Indian agents who imposed and administered the Indian Act, how our people would look out for them and hide from them when they were gathering in the potlatch, or even sometimes in plain sight by quickly switching to singing Christian hymns. How they would look out or have lookouts to warn if the Indian agent was coming so they could change what they were doing before he arrived. Through my grandmother, I learned about the sacrifice and courage needed to fulfill our roles and responsibilities, and by doing that, to effect change. And it is with my grandmother's life in mind that I want to say a few words about where we are collectively and what we must collectively do to confront Canada's legacy of colonialism. She lived that legacy. Today, as a country, we still continue to live that legacy in very real ways. And this needs to change. In an article I recently read in The Atlantic about Indigenous matters in the United States, the author writes, quote, "We live in a time of historical reconsideration as more and more people recognize that the sins of the past still haunt the present," end quote. These words are also true in Canada on matters of racial justice for Indigenous peoples and addressing the legacy of colonialism. There is a reconsideration taking place. There is a growing awareness and understanding, a new recognition. I was first elected Regional Chief of British Columbia in 2009. Since that time, what I have witnessed is that the recognition among Canadians about the importance of addressing Indigenous reconciliation has changed in dramatic ways. From the young to the not so young, so many Canadians are learning more, yearning to understand more, are listening and are wanting to take action themselves and to see action taken. There are now what we call allies everywhere, as distinct from the past where it often felt that they were few and far between. So this is important for making change. And in this greater awareness, there is an understanding that the sins of the past still haunt the present. We see this when we look at issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, access to clean drinking water, the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, the vast numbers of Indigenous children and youth in care, the tragic rates of suicide, particularly among Indigenous youth, and many other social and economic indicators. We also have been starkly reminded how the sins of the past still haunt us in the present through the COVID-19 pandemic. Certain peoples and communities have been disproportionately impacted. This is true within countries and viewed globally. We see how privilege and historic and existing disparities have contributed to different outcomes and degrees of suffering in the pandemic. The endurance of systemic racism has been highlighted. But beyond the public discourse and political acknowledgements and rhetoric, the reconsiderations are not taking place fast enough within institutional change and with reform. And this brings us to the heart of the issue and my experience at the center of government, where much of that change has to be led. Why is this legacy still with us? How come it has been so hard for the necessary changes to be made? What do governments need to do, and why haven't they done it? 4 decades ago, and Sven talked about this when the constitutional discussions were taking place about the repatriation of our Constitution and the development of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a substantive political discussion in Canada's history about the rights of Indigenous peoples took place. It resulted in Section 35 of the Constitution that affirmed and protected Indigenous rights, including treaty rights. The inclusion of Section 35 was an important development. But the reality is that the way Section 35 was treated by governments after it was enacted turned Section 35 more into being evidence of our legacy of colonialism rather than as a tool for addressing it. To understand why this is the case, consider the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as compared to Section 35, how they have been used by governments. Both the Charter and Section 35 were adopted in 1982. With regards to the Charter, governments began organizing themselves to comply with it, including laws, policies, and practices. Of course, the courts had and do have a role to play to identify the limits and extent, confirm meetings, and settle the hard and important issues. But no government and no politician would ever dare to say to a Canadian, you don't have the right to free speech, or go prove that you have the right to free speech. Well, Indigenous peoples and Section 35 were treated differently. Governments did not address the review of laws, policies, and practices to respect Indigenous rights as they did with parts of the Charter. And indeed, when Indigenous peoples say they have Indigenous and historic treaty rights, the response has been, and remains to this day, go prove it. And even then, after decades in the court with clear Supreme Court of Canada decisions, even then we see governments fail to implement the decisions or act like rights exist. Indeed, this is what we see in the headlines today, whether it be in relation to the lobster fisheries in the East, Indigenous patients dying in emergency rooms while racist comments are made, to confusion and chaos from a failure to have proper decision-making regimes with Indigenous peoples over resource development. This practice, this hypocrisy, this affirmation of charter rights and the need to change laws and policies, but denial of Indigenous rights and not changing laws and policies is, in my opinion, the most insidious and prime example of systemic racism rooted in the legacy of colonialism that remains pervasive at the highest level of government and underpins the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. Now, while some progress has been made in implementing Section 35, the practice of denial has not changed. Unfortunately, shamefully and disapprovingly or disappointingly, we can look at the current government as an illustration of this. On February the 14th, 2018, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stood up in the House of Commons and acknowledged he and his government knew of this long-standing hypocrisy. The Prime Minister said these words, quote, 2017 marked 35 years since Aboriginal and treaty rights were recognized and affirmed through Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The government of the day, led by my father, did not intend to include these rights at the outset. It was the unspoken advocacy of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, supported by non-Indigenous Canadians, that forced the government to reconsider. Imagine what that must have been like, to have fought so hard for so long against colonialism, rallying your communities, reaching out to Canadians, riding the Constitutional Express, and in the end, to finally be recognized and included, to see your rights enshrined and protected in the foundational document on which Canada's democracy rests. Now imagine the mounting disappointment, the unsurprising and familiar headache, and the rising tide of anger when governments that had promised so much did so little to keep their word. End quote. In that speech, Prime Minister Trudeau pledged to adopt a new recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework to finally end this hypocrisy, to entrench the law standards and create mechanisms to ensure Indigenous rights are upheld and not constantly fought about. In committing to do this, he was building on the 10 principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, which the government released in July of 2017, to guide the relationship, including the development of a rights recognition framework. The 10 principles, which I understand are still hung on the walls in both French and English in every CERNA and ISC office across the country, were intended to start preparing the public service for the larger shifts to come in how to work with Indigenous peoples. The goal was to set initial guidance on the recognition of rights, to support efforts to end the denial of Indigenous rights that led to disempowerment and assimilationist practices and policies. But guess what? This did not happen. Indeed, within a few months after that Valentine's Day speech, those aspirations were abandoned. The government doesn't even talk about it anymore. Like governments past, this government just accepts that it is hypocritical, accepts the entrenched colonial and racist status quo, and carries on. Like governments past, it simply accepts the legacy of colonialism should not be uprooted. What is so upsetting with this government is that they had a path to follow, but they would not follow it. During those constitutional talks in the 1980s, one of the great Indigenous leaders of the time from British Columbia, the late Chief Joe Mathias, spoke of the type of leadership that is needed. He said to, quote, "Behold the turtle. He moves forward when he sticks his neck out," end quote. I think about these words a lot because they sum up the challenge and the problem we have, which is a problem of will, a lack of political will, a lack of courage, a lack of willingness to sacrifice. Because the reality is that we know what to do. Generations of advocacy by Indigenous peoples, countless studies and analyses, TRC, MIWG, RCAP, UNDRIP have all revealed the solutions. They have been stated time and again. Indigenous people know what needs to be done. We have known and said it for generations. The government now knows also. So What are those changes? There are certain foundational transformative shifts that are needed to be established as the basis for a proper relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. At the core of the legacy of colonialism for First Nations has been, of course, the Indian Act, a colonial statute that is well over a century old. Today, the Indian Act remains the primary instrument that governs the lives of First Nations. The Indian Act was designed to break up the families, governments, social and cultural systems of First Nations. It outlawed our governments, was the basis of the residential schools, cemented the Indian Reserve System, and criminalized aspects of our culture and way of life. The Indian Act also denied the basic human rights of First Nations to vote, to move around, to hire a lawyer, and so on. Today, much of the Indian Act remains unchanged. And the federal government, through Indigenous Services Canada, spends billions of dollars every year managing poverty through a colonial statute, acting as a paternalistic overseer of a racist system. Alongside the Indian Act and its express denial of Indigenous peoples and their rights, there has been the reality of the omission, the denial of Indigenous peoples and their rights broadly in government laws, policies, and practices. Our federal government laws are out of date. With very few exceptions, Canada's laws, such as those around lands and resources, presume that Indigenous land rights do not exist. This despite the fact, again, of dozens of Supreme Court of Canada decisions to the contrary. This creates uncertainty about land and resource development, which is rooted in the government's failure to recognize and implement Indigenous rights. This is why we see so much conflict and tension on the land base and an inability to move forward. So how do we make the shift and put those new foundations in place? Well, for years, I and others expressing the solutions we've known for years have laid out a plan for what needs to be done. I have often, including when I was Minister of Justice, described this plan as having the following 5 elements. 1, entrench recognition standards. Set legislated standards that all public officials have to act based on principles of rights recognition to end the practice of denial like I just described. This is how we ensure Indigenous rights are upheld consistently across all government does. 2, legislate UNDRIP. More on that in a moment. 3, establish mechanisms for self-government and moving out of the Indian Act, establishing clear pathways that First Nations can use to support their self-determination, including self-government. This is something that I've spoken about for years, to move out of policy-based negotiations that limit self-government arbitrarily to actually requiring government to recognize Indigenous governments that have rebuilt their governing systems and have chosen to move out of the Indian Act. 4, establish new Indigenous institutions and capacity support for nation building, critically starting to end the roles of ministries created to colonize and moving supports and work to institutions that are Indigenous controlled. This is part of ending the Indian Act. 5, establishing new oversight, accountability, and dispute resolution institutions. These are so necessary. Government needs to be accountable, reported on, assessed. Rights implementation needs to progress, and we need to know how it is progressing. As this is happening, we also have a responsibility to move a far more solutions-oriented approach to advancing the work. And out of the courts, systematizing a culture of dispute resolution that is effective, appropriate, faster, and cheaper. Such solutions are not only needed between non-Indigenous governments and Indigenous peoples, but also within Indigenous nations to support nation rebuilding. For example, in determining such issues as boundaries and relationships of laws. Importantly, this is also a bridge to how our Indigenous legal orders will be operating more and more every day in guiding relations with each other and with other governments. Now, I know I need to say something about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how it fits into the work of rebuilding Indigenous nations within Canada and ameliorating the social ills that still plague so many Indigenous communities. There's been a lot of focus on UNDRIP in recent years, as the TRC called it the framework of reconciliation. And federally and provincially, governments have enacted or are in the process of enacting legislation to implement it. It is also increasingly framing the way we talk about these issues today and in the lexicon of rights discourse. The Declaration was developed through a deliberative process involving Indigenous peoples and states over decades. What the UNDRIP does is express in the specific context of Indigenous peoples basic human rights norms that Canada and Canadians all cherish and have for decades, ever since the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was adopted after World War II. The UNDRIP is often described as articulating the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. These need to be upheld and implemented. Doing that is one part of entrenching recognition standards, as I mentioned earlier. So while important, passing laws implementing the UNDRIP, like we see in BC in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or federally in the proposed Bill C-15, while politically significant, are just a small step of the work that actually needs to be done. It is just one of the 5 things that I mentioned earlier that needs to be done. Upon passage, the reality is these bills do not address the Indian Act. They do not support the rebuilding of Indigenous governments. They do not set up new dispute resolution bodies to address the inevitable issues that will arise. They do not provide for independent oversight of government action. They do not change the Indian Reserve System, address systemic racism in policing, health, or any other sector, nor do they establish new models of decision-making that provides for certainty with and respect for Indigenous rights. What they are is a marker for the future work needed that, in truth, we could have been well down the path to doing with or without this legislation. What we need are mechanisms to implement the articles of the UNDRIP here in Canada. The courts can't create those mechanisms. We need political will. We need legislators who are committed and civil servants to carry it out. So governments have no mechanisms for the implementation of the minimum standards of UNDRIP. They have no mechanisms for oversight and enforcement, and they have no new supports for nations to self-determine and self-govern. And if any government official, political or administrative person tells you otherwise, it means that they do not understand their own legislation, its impact, or the reality and necessities of what is actually required to deconstruct the ongoing colonial legacy and transform relations. Similarly, those who spread fear about these bills are just spreading misinformation. The UNDRIP laws, as I said, are a small step forward, not more, not less, and nothing to fear. Well, let's pass them. What I do fear, though, is with the necessary passage of such laws, that the public and worse, policymakers might think the problems are solved, that the hard work has been done, when this, of course, is not the case at all. And why I was pushing for the change that was needed in the system, and to be quite frank, saw the UNDRIP legislation as a bit of a distraction, albeit necessary political action, a distraction to actually doing the hard work to implement Section 35 and develop a framework to revise all of Canada's laws, policies, and operational practices with process and resources to undertake that work, to build the missing tools. We need tools for concrete action, and those tools need to be in the law, not just in policies and practices, because we know what happens. Delay in action doing nothing, talking and fighting in the courts. This is what I fear will become the future of these laws if they are not quickly supplemented with additional legislation that fills out the mechanisms that are needed. So please view any UNDRIP legislation as only a small, albeit important legislative step, and focus work on further legislation that is required. And do not think for one moment it will be the panacea. Now, there's another reason why the impact of these laws are limited in the short and medium term. The need for transformative change to take place, for it to take place in Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples have much to do as well. There are foundational questions Indigenous peoples must lead in answering, while governments get their own house in order. Work that Indigenous peoples themselves can do. And UNDRIP is not going to rebuild our nations for us. The truth is, we are all beginning to see the need for the work of nation rebuilding. That is what the government, or what is the government of a nation? Who speaks for it? Who are the nation's citizens? How are they chosen? If there is free, prior, and informed consent, who can give it and under what arrangement? And many more. These are the questions that Indigenous peoples must answer to actually be self-determining. No one can answer them for us. That is what colonization tried to do. And we know now the outcome of that. Only the colonized can decolonize. We delve even deeper in what the UNDRIP does and does not do. The UNDRIP standards do not define the relationship between Indigenous and state laws and jurisdictions, how these distinct orders of government should interact. Yes, consent is one mechanism of that relationship, an important one, but in Canada, we also need to figure out how to make shared decision-making or shared decisions and co-manage as we operationalize consent on the ground between non-Indigenous decision-making systems and Indigenous legal orders. I could go on, but I think my point is clear. Adopting the UNDRIP standards alone without clear mechanisms, processes, and structures for operationalizing them, and without nations leading the way based on self-determination and doing the hard work of nation and government rebuilding, will not provide the answer to our current challenges. It has been understood and accepted that the path of making foundational, transformative change has always been and will always be controversial in the Indigenous world and Canada as a whole. I understand that change brings with it dynamics of fear and resistance as people realize they will have to change, that positions of power and privilege may be lost as new voices, including women's voices, take a more prominent place as old structures, broken structures, Indian-X structures are dismantled, as economies are restructured and governments reshaped. But I firmly believe there is no other way. One does not tinker around the edges of colonialism. One does not reconcile with racism while making small shifts on the side. Colonialism, Indigenous-specific racism, are the dead roots at the heart of the history of this country. And if we let them remain as we have and do not uproot them, the outcome is not a good one. Publicly, this government has said it was going to finally adopt these solutions. What happened, the real story, was a failure of leadership at the very top and a failure of will, an unwillingness to stick out their neck. What Chief Joe Mathias asked us to do. A failure to care enough to actually act in real, meaningful, and tangible ways to help transform lives, to create space to rebuild Indigenous nations, and therefore a more prosperous Canada. Rather, they promise bold change while largely doing the same old thing. I hope this gives you a glimpse of where we are at and what we need to do. To be clear, I remain positive. There is progress. Nations are doing hard work in new ways with innovation. Canadians are adding more of their voices to this important work every day. There's a greater understanding among more people about what must be done. The 10 principles remain on the books. UNDRIP legislation, while not all of what is needed and only a starting point, is nonetheless a step forward. Here in British Columbia, while lots needs to be done, there is increasing efforts by government and Indigenous leaders to try and move forward in new ways. We need people to stick their necks out, to move forward like Grace, like my granny, but not just political leaders, all of us, everywhere, to say change is not only needed, but it is urgent and necessary, and to push and just get on with it. And yes, when it was needed to speak truth to power, when that moment came for me in my political life in this government, it just so happened it was very public. It was the opposite of my grandmother, who had to speak truth to power out of sight, unseen, and for the most part, unacknowledged. But I think perhaps in that is the lesson that we are making progress, that the unseen is becoming seen. When that happens, what needs to be done can become more into focus, and more people are motivated and inspired and challenged to play their roles and fulfill their responsibilities. More will stick their necks out. And through this act, we all benefit and move forward. We will see what each other is doing, and take strength in that and combine our efforts and build a better future together. Each of you online here tonight has a role to play. Your opportunities to stick your necks out. I know you're already doing it every day in the context and realities of your lives. And as we find ways to continue to do it more together, we will be ever stronger. Our shared lives will be enriched, and our country more just, inclusive, and fair. And in closing, as I would often say when I was regional chief, the work goes on, and so it does, and we are the better for it. Galakasla, thank you for listening to me, and thank you for all the people before me, including Grace, for your extraordinary work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. What a phenomenal talk, and we can't wait for the memoir to come out. And indeed, if you'd give us the honor of launching it at SFU, the Institute, we'd love to do that. So I want to cut straight to the chase, because there are a lot of people here on the call, and already quite a number of questions. Sven and I have agreed to go from 2 questions each to 1, so as to allow as many people as possible to come in. So I would just like to take up this really acute comparison that you draw between, on the one hand, Section 35 and then the Charter, and the kind of hypocrisy of this. And it raises all kinds of questions about the possibility of decolonizing law. So what does it look like to decolonize law? I mean, I think you have already provided some really interesting suggestions as to how this might happen. But I want to take it down to a slightly finer grain and refer to a panel that we had, actually it was another book launch that we had last week on the logics of genocide. And there was a fascinating discussion of the way in which Canadian courts have functioned in such a way as to, in those very decisions, such as when they seem to be favorable for the recognition of Indigenous treaty rights, they also seem to, at the same time, so the author was arguing, double down on colonialism insofar as the courts still refuse to countenance Indigenous forms of jurisprudence. So that whole question that you raised about the proof of a claim to the land of evidence. The very rules of evidence themselves seem to be deeply biased against those forms of jurisprudence that lie in songs and stories and myths. And they're actually just dismissed as forms of mythology, without, at the same time, a recognition of the very mythology upon which the Canadian judicial system is itself based, which is the myth of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. So it seems like there's a deep, deep problem here. I'd be very interested in your thoughts about how we can, really deepen this process of decolonization, given those conditions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a big question. I guess I'll say a number of things. On the first point, in terms of how Indigenous peoples have had to turn to the courts to uphold their rights and have their rights recognized, including the first declaration of title in Chilcotin. Thankfully, we have seen very activist courts in terms of propelling Indigenous rights forward and elevating Indigenous rights, clarifying in their system a lot of Indigenous people's rights more so than governments have. So we have had the benefit of many successful Supreme Court of Canada decisions on Aboriginal title and rights. And I think that that's a positive thing. At the same time, and I would have liked to have been involved in your debate and discussion on this issue, and we need to look at laws, our institutions, whether they be our courts, whether they be within our justice system in terms of the RCM police or otherwise. We need to, as you say, look to decolonize these institutional structures, to understand that there is systemic racism embedded within those structures. Certainly, part of what we need to discuss and look at and embrace are Indigenous legal structures, legal orders, and ways of being that have enabled us to survive for millennia. We need to have governments that embrace Indigenous self-determination and self-government in order for Indigenous nations to rebuild their institutions of government and draw down the jurisdictions that they choose, building their constitutions, but also potentially looking at getting involved and taking over, for example, the administration of justice, developing their own court system in partnership or otherwise. But we also need to look at the institutions that we have now, whether that be the superior courts or the provincial courts. More Indigenous peoples need to be appointed to the bench. I look forward to the day when there is a Supreme Court of Canada justice that is Indigenous. And I have to say and applaud the Supreme Court justices, particularly the Chief Justice recently, for having regard to or for Indigenous legal systems and referencing Indigenous legal orders in some of the discussions that they have been having. So there's lots of ways and places that we need to have these conversations. It starts with Indigenous peoples being able to be self-determining and self-governing. And it also starts with us looking ourselves in the mirror as actors in various institutions and understanding the systemic barriers and the racism and the bias and discrimination that exists within them.
Thank you very much. This terrific answer. I'm going to turn it over now to Sven. Once Sven has posed his question, and once you respond, we'll go to the audience for questions. Sven, over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And like Samir, I'm really keen to get to the questions. I've read a number of the questions, and they're really important and powerful issues. And Jody, thank you for those words. It was an incredible lecture, and so much of what we were hoping to get out of it in terms of a pathway forward. You've raised the questions. I one of the questions, and I'm not going to ask this question, but I hope you'll have a chance to address it, really goes to that issue, that key issue that you've raised of self-government and the tension that we've seen in a number of contexts, not the least in Wet'suwet'en, between the role of hereditary chiefs and elected band councils under the Indian Act. And as you've pointed out so many times, that this is an issue that must be addressed by First Nations directly. And I hope you'll have a chance to perhaps elaborate a bit on that. But I wanted to ask you about something else. You have been described by a number of people, but Ken Coates, for example, a respected historian of First Nations issues, has described you as the most influential Indigenous federal politician in Canadian history. You were at the peak of political power. I mean, you were Attorney General, Minister of Justice, and now you're sitting in the very back corner of Parliament as an independent member. And I have to say personally, I have some sense of what that means, because in my 25 years in public life, for 4 of those years, I was there too. I was in that very back corner without any party status, no status in the House, no status on committees. I wonder if you could just maybe talk a little bit about how you see life now and sort of how it compares with those 4 years in cabinet, and also maybe if I may be so presumptuous as to ask, maybe talk about what may lay ahead. I mean, you spoke, obviously you have an incredible, rich experience in a number of different areas. The Assembly of First Nations is looking for a new national chief who's going to be elected. You've talked about some of the misogyny. You'd be the first woman there. What's it like in the backbenches now? How has that affected your approach to politics, and what may lay ahead?
Well, thanks for all those questions. I mean, I guess first of all, in terms of Ken Coates, I love Ken Coates. He and I have many good conversations, and appreciate him talking about the influence that I have and had. Look, I had the great honor to be the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada for over 3 years. We accomplished an extraordinary amount in my term as minister. I was supported by an extraordinary public service and staff in order to be able to do that. And I think that absolutely, I was the first Indigenous Minister of Justice and AG, but I'm not going to be the last Indigenous Minister of Justice and AG. I took a very public walk, so to speak, from the front benches of the government side to the very back corner as a backbencher. Very conscious walk, and I wouldn't change anything that I've done. I don't regret anything in terms of the decisions and the job I did. I feel that influence and using my voice and participating in the important issues and discussions and debates that brought me into federal politics in the first place are still there. As a backbencher, I have the opportunity, not necessarily with the governing party MPs, but with most MPs in Parliament wanting to work with me and give me space in the debates and discussions, whether that be in the House or in committees, and I appreciate that. But I, based on my experience, which is kind of told in the title of my upcoming book, Indian in the Cabinet, I came from a small fishing community of Cape Mudge to Ottawa with all of these things that I wanted to accomplish in terms of social justice issues. And I had the opportunity to directly do so many things. I had a very tumultuous experience, but my resolve is so much stronger in terms of the necessity to continue to use my voice, to use my experience, to continue to stand up so we know that Indigenous voices, women's voices continue to be present around these tables where we haven't been present before, like Grace. So I'm going to continue to do that. To the last part of your question, and you had a lot there in terms of my future plans, I'm honored to be the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville. Who knows when an election's going to be, probably in the fall. When I make a decision about that aspect of my life, my constituents will be the first ones to know, and then everybody else. But I will say I'm going to continue in whatever role or roles that I play to be a very outspoken advocate. I know that my voice carries a lot, and people listen to the words that I say, and that is a tremendous responsibility, one that I take very seriously. words matter because you can't take them back. So I try to be very careful with the words that I say, but I will continue to speak out, as I hope everybody will continue to speak out. People from right across the country have talked to me about national chief. I had a debate in my own mind back in 2013 whether I would run for national chief. So there's lots of opportunities that are presenting themselves, but I'm really happy where I am in terms of being the MP for Vancouver Granville right now as an independent, because I feel and know that we need more independent voices in Parliament, people that are representing their constituents in Ottawa as opposed to reflecting the views of the Prime Minister or their party leaders to their constituents wherever their riding is.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jody. So let's now turn to the audience. There are some really great questions here, and let's start off with a fairly hard-hitting one, if you don't mind. There's one from Erwin Ostindi, who does a lot of work with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. He's a self-identified Dutch settler. He's also done a fair amount of work with us at the Institute. And his question runs as follows. How do you reconcile your own writing and advocacy for a federal Indigenous rights framework with terra nullius assumptions about Canada? Why do you believe Canada has a right to exist as a foundation upon which First Nations rights are exercised? Is this not extremely pragmatic and more akin to merely revisiting 154 years of federal liberal and conservative policies? Are these questions and critiques by Russ Diabo merely fear-mongering?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I hope I have taken it in appropriately or properly. You know, I've known Russ Diabo for quite some time, and he and I have had some interesting discussions. We don't necessarily see eye to eye on how we can approach issues in terms of upholding Indigenous rights and rebuilding Indigenous nations. But that's okay. I mean, there's a diversity of opinion between and amongst Indigenous peoples in this country. And I have been very consistent in my view and have been raised from the time I was born to know who I am, to know where I come from, to understand my rights and responsibilities and the place of Indigenous peoples in this country. I was very proud of my father and other leaders for the enshrinement of Section 35 in the Constitution of Canada. I see Section 35 as a full box of rights that Indigenous peoples have. The inherent right of self-government. We have rights to land, and all of that, the rebuilding of Indigenous nations can and must occur within a stronger Canada, that there is a place for Indigenous nations, rebuilt nations, within our consistently and constantly evolving system of cooperative federalism. I don't know if that exactly answers the question, but I believe the place of Indigenous peoples in this country was not addressed when the so-called Fathers of Confederation came together in 1867 and before. And what we're doing in terms of seeking out true reconciliation in this country is correcting that mistake.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question from Yassi Pirani. Despite the legal precedent established in the case of reporter Justin Brake in 2019 in Muskrat Falls, journalists and press freedom advocate organizations are still having to work tirelessly to highlight the unlawful way that injunctions and exclusion zones have been used to bar journalists from reporting on RCMP raids, as evidenced by the events last year at Wet'suwet'en and just yesterday at Pachidat and Dididat. What do you, and sorry if I've mispronounced those names. What do you see as the way forward? Do you see this as a question of policy? How can we honor and strengthen the critical role of the media in reconciliation? A very important question in an era in which the media is increasingly looked at as the enemy of the people in North America globally. So thank you for the question, Yassi.
Yeah, Yassi, I think it's a very important question, and I guess I'll just take the last part of the question first in terms of the role of the media. The Fifth Estate is so fundamental and necessary in terms of challenging and keeping governments accountable, and we need to have more of that. There are very good journalists, reporters, and there are some that are not so good. But we need more reporting. We certainly need more reporting of the reality in Indigenous communities, what Indigenous peoples have to contend with, the challenges certainly, but also the success stories that we're seeing right across the country in terms of Indigenous peoples and their rebuilding efforts, what they're doing to ultimately improve the quality of life of their communities and their people. The media has a critical role to play in sharing those stories. In terms of your question around, for example, Wet'suwet'en and seeking injunctions and preventing media, and not just media, but other people from going into certain places. We're using tools, governments and companies are using tools that the courts provide. This is a result of the lack of actually addressing the issues that Sven talked about in terms of the Wet'suwet'en and the necessity of the Wet'suwet'en people to be able to resolve their governance realities between and among themselves as citizens of the Wet'suwet'en Nation. Other governments, federal governments, and provincial governments, for that matter, have had a role to play in that divide and conquer reality that exists. We have to stop that. We have to stop looking to the courts and other institutions, whether that be through the courts and enforcement mechanisms to prevent us from actually doing something. But we need to get at the root causes of why this exists in the first place. Stop making excuses, stop delaying, stop sending the hard issues that need to be tackled off to the courts to be resolved in some other time. But I guess I'll close in terms of the media. The media can do an extraordinary job in telling the unfolding deconstruction of the colonial legacy in this country, just as you've highlighted the realities of racism and systemic racism. Just recently, the judge that was walking in Stanley Park. These are important stories that we need to understand and need to be told.
Thank you so much. Now, Jody, the next question is somewhat long, and it is in the chat section. And if you'd like to just read along, you can. But I will again read it out for the benefit of the recording. I think it's a really important question in terms of drawing the connections between colonialism, colonization, and capitalism. Colonization doesn't just have a logic of its own, irrespective or unrelated to capitalism. And I think this is, in a sense, where the rubber really hits the road. So that was my editorial, but here's the question. How do you find a middle ground resolution between UNDRIP and the contradictions it encounters with the Canadian/capitalist ideology economy? Obviously, introducing UNDRIP is necessary, but for Canada as a state, how can we introduce it or mechanisms that support it without so much of the resistance from, let's say, the Canadian and we could say global capitalist class? Thank you for your talk. I appreciate it so much. Also, I noticed that the talk was heavily geared towards law and government. I mean, that should come as no surprise. I'm personally very interested in Indigenous epistemology and pedagogy, and the contradictory presence of Western-style legal structures come into play here. Do you see a resolution between Western-style legal systems, which are oppressive in their very nature, and Indigenous ones? And how does that play out? Can a Canadian government, economic system, and legal system exist and still respect indigeneity and serious reconciliatory efforts? Now, it's a big question. You can answer part or whole. It's really up to you. But I think it's a very thoughtful question from I think a student. So.
Well, I think it's an incredibly thoughtful question, and I'd love to have a conversation with whomever asked it, because I'm not going to be able to address everything of which you said, but would be fun to have a discussion about it. I guess to the last point, and then I'll talk a little bit about UNDRIP and the perceived conflict between UNDRIP and capitalism as raised by many politicians and beyond politicians that are fearful of the reality of FPIC, for example. In terms of the Western legal system, laws, and policies, I absolutely believe that Indigenous legal orders and laws, as they are rebuilt and made, and they have been in terms of 25 self-governing nations across the country, can be combined, can be mindful of the other. At a very basic but fundamental level, I believe that Indigenous laws and legal traditions and ways of being, our worldview, the interconnectedness that I talked about, is fundamental to transforming the nature of the federal government, our Canadian institutions, and making them more readily available to tackle the major issues facing our time, from climate change to pandemic response to social justice issues. If I learned anything from coming from Cape Mudge to Ottawa, thinking that I was going to contribute towards creating the space for Indigenous nations in this country to rebuild within Canada, what I learned in the challenge of doing so was that federal laws and the federal government and Parliament have a lot to learn from Indigenous ways of being and legal orders. And the more that we embrace that, the more the laws, policies, and practices of the federal government and other governments are changed to have regard for Indigenous knowledge and teachings and laws, the better we will be in terms of consensus-based decision-making, for example. And so that kind of, I think, tackles a bit of the question that the second part of your question. But in terms of UNDRIP and capitalism and the concern about colonialism versus capitalism, I think I have your question right in my mind. We have seen with C-15 many people, many members of Parliament, particularly from a particular party, raising fear and the specter that the world is going to fall if we pass C-15. We know that is not true. We know that that comes from the place of wanting to instill fear to prevent change from happening. So there are articles in UNDRIP that speak to economic development, that speak to free, prior, and informed consent. And when we're talking about free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, it has been completely taken out of context and misunderstood purposefully. And we need to get away from that. And we need to have a real conversation about what free, prior, and informed consent means. And that it doesn't mean that everything is going to stop, that there's no economic development, that there's no resource development. What it means is that we have to have different patterns of relationships to operationalize that consent. And that consent is not and should not be placed in the discussion around consultation and accommodation. It's very different from that. We're talking about Indigenous peoples who have rights, including title to their lands, that must be a part of the decision-making process and the creation of new patterns of relationships for those decisions with other governments. Intergovernmental relationships need to occur, and Indigenous peoples, and this is the hard work that I talked about in my remarks, need to rebuild, need to build their institutions of government. So when consent is required, there is an understanding of who provides that consent. This is a really complicated question, but anybody that says if we adopt or embrace the UNDRIP articles into Canadian law, or we enable Indigenous peoples to be self-determining and self-governing, that somehow that is going to shut down the economy of the country, is hanging out in fear and trying to instill that in others. Ultimately, when Indigenous nations rebuild within a stronger Canada, of course, their communities will be the better for it, but Indigenous Canada will be the better for it.
Thanks very much. Sven Robinson now has another question. Sven, please.
I just wanted to follow up, Jody, on some of your last comments around the issue of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, and some of the fear mongering that's been going on. People saying, "Oh, this means that there's going to be an absolute veto on everything," and so on. And of course, the reality is that we don't have to look very far here in British Columbia to see how absolutely absurd that is, whether it's in the context of Site C and First Nations, Moberly First Nations in Site C, whether it's in the context of hereditary chiefs in Wet'suwet'en, whether it's here with Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish in Trans Mountain. I mean, there has been absolutely denial of consent, free, prior, and informed consent, and ignoring that consent. So, as you point out, Jody, I mean, the fear mongering is without any foundation. Some of us wish, indeed, that there were more reality to that, because, of course, in the case, for example, of Trans Mountain, the eloquent pleas of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation and Squamish and others aren't just affecting those nations, but they affect all of us, right? And so I wish there were a bit more substance to it, frankly, than that. I wanted to ask you if you could maybe just say something about a movement, because a couple of students have raised this with me. What's land back all about? What's land back all about? What does it mean when we say land back? And what are your thoughts on that as an objective?
Well, I think if you were to ask, I appreciate first of all, your comments around FPIC, and I would be hopeful that there could be more discussions created or had panel discussions around what FPIC actually means, so we can sift through how it's often used in the context of political conflict or for political purposes. It's not a new concept. It's one that has been in the courts for a long time. And the Supreme Court of Canada says if you want to do business on Indigenous territories, it would be highly advisable. I'm not directly quoting the Supreme Court, but to get to the consent of the Indigenous communities that are present. And now I just lost the question that you asked me after that, after I was going off on FPIC.
And actually,
land back.
Yeah.
Land.
That important concept.
Yeah, it is an important concept, and I suspect if you were to ask one individual versus another, you get three individuals, you'd probably get three different answers, and that's okay. For me, as a First Nations person from Wewaka, as part of the Kwakwaka'wakw, I mean, I envision Indigenous peoples in this country moving through what I like to call the post-colonial door, and having rebuilt nations, having our own institutions of government, how we elect our governing body, the powers that we give the governing body to make decisions, who our citizens are, developing our own constitution. This is rebuilding work that needs to continue to happen. In order to be functioning governments, we need, like all governments, we need a revenue stream in order to support our governments. That has to happen. And we also need to have land in which to sustain our communities and to expand our communities. When I think about land back, and I haven't actually consciously thought about what I think that means for some time, in that direct context of which you asked the question, but in my mind, land back obviously means that we have title to specific territories, and by virtue of that title, the ability to have our communities and have our communities continue to build and expand. But it also means that we need to look at having a role in what happens on those lands, our title lands and our rights territories. And that means entering into new arrangements, new agreements, new relationships with other governments that actually speak to real shared decision-making and cooperative management. And that includes over the water. I mean, it is for me and for so many people, a challenge that there is a minister or a person in Ottawa that thinks that they have the ability to determine what happens without engaging with the original Indigenous peoples of these lands. That has to change, and new patterns of behavior and relationships have to be formed. If not, we're going to continue to see the conflict and the struggles that we've talked about and that I talked about in my speech. So land back for me sees Indigenous nations rebuilt with rebuilt governance and institutions on a territory that we can expand and thrive on, and also with practicing and thriving cultures within a cooperative a continuing evolving cooperative federation.
Thanks, Jody. And I see that Erwin has actually posted a couple of good references to land back in the chat there. Folks are interested in pursuing that. If I could just ask one more brief question, and then I know we've got some other questions out there. But Jody, could you talk about say something about Indigenous languages? Because language, of course, in many ways goes to the heart of identity. Quebecers have understood this with in the context of the French language, and we know that I think there are something like 53 Indigenous languages, and up until recently, only a handful of them had any hope of surviving as languages. Is this a bit of a good news story? Have there been some positive development in terms of strengthening of Indigenous languages, and what can you share about the importance of that?
Well, I mean, in terms of the importance of Indigenous languages, there are, as you say, many, many different Indigenous languages. The language of my people is Kwakwala. I don't speak my language fluently, but I have the ability to understand a lot of what is said and a lot of what my grandmother has said to me in the language. But we're losing the language, our language. We're losing our speakers that spoke our ancient dialects. And with language comes an understanding of our fundamental interconnection with the land, with people. Through language, we tell stories that aren't necessarily translated into another language. So it's fundamentally important to who we are and how we have continued to exist for millennia. So we need to do everything we can to ensure that our languages survive. They have been on the decline. We have international reports that speak to the dying languages that we have. How can we address that situation? Well, we need to continue to increase the teaching of Indigenous languages in post-secondary institutions, in elementary school. I know my sister is taking language classes every Wednesday night to make sure she can hone her skills. And we also need to look to the federal government. Federal laws were responsible for much of the loss of our languages and made illegal much of our culture, all of our culture. And, we've seen some movement. We've seen the language legislation that came out of the federal government, but we have to support Indigenous peoples. And this comes back, as it always does, to self-government and Indigenous peoples being able to rebuild their institutions, to make decisions for themselves, and to be able to make those decisions to support their ways of being, their culture, and their languages. We've seen in Indigenous communities that are self-governing, we see an increase in their practicing their culture and speaking their languages. And this needs to increase, and Indigenous peoples need to be supported in doing so.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jody. I think we've got time for one more question, and I'll take the chair's privilege and pose that to you. Earlier in the year, I gave a submission before the Special Legislative Committee to reform BC's Police Act, and I was briefed ahead of time that I should really focus on systemic racism, because not everybody on that committee was, in fact, convinced that such a thing existed. And we know that the commissioner of the RCMP also was somewhat in two minds about its existence. And it seems that even members of the NDP caucus were not all convinced that such a thing at the provincial level, we're convinced that systemic racism indeed exists as a reality. And one of the things I went into is the vast overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. And according to a 2019 report, the Ministry of Justice, and I quote, the levels of incarceration, the numbers of incarcerated Indigenous peoples has just worsened year by year. Indigenous inmates in federal institutions rose from 20% of the total population in 2008-2009 to 28% between 2017 and 2018, even though Indigenous peoples represent only something like 4.1% of the overall Canadian population. Now, if that's not an example of systemic racism, I don't know what is. So my question isn't really so much about systemic racism, but what is it that can be done specifically about this problem of criminal justice and the prison system and this egregious overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples within it? I'd be very interested to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's an important question. It's something that certainly I sought to tackle when I was Minister of Justice, when I was regional chief and know and see Indigenous peoples and Black Canadians and other marginalized people that face overwhelming overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. What can we do about it? There's many things. First of all, we need to understand why that situation exists in the first place, and understand that the overrepresentation of our peoples in the criminal justice system is a symptom of the ongoing reality and legacy of colonialism. And I feel like I'm going to say it again, a broken record, but a record that needs to continue to be played. It has to do with the lack of self-determination and self-government. Indigenous nations need to be able to rebuild and to make decisions for themselves and for their own people. And through self-government, decisions can be made about jurisdictions, around being involved in policing, around and changing, which we've seen in various models in the country, changing the way policing happens to be a more community undertaking, as opposed to a very punitive only undertaking, but actually embracing new models of community safety. But also looking at the administration of justice, taking over the courts, looking at bolstering restorative justice measures, specialized courts. We need federal government and provincial governments to actually support and invest in restorative justice measures, and to enable Indigenous peoples, if they want to step into that place, to be able to do so. But more fundamental to that, that's fundamental. Equally as important is that we have to look at the laws that we currently have, and how those laws, the Criminal Code and the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, contributes to the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples. We need to get rid of mandatory minimum penalties, which is a prime reason why there's overrepresentation. We need to look at how we engage with individuals at a policing level and within the courts. Bail. There's lots of things that we can talk about in terms of addressing these issues, but how we assess risk in prisons is another example that's riddled with racism. Indigenous peoples need to be able to see themselves in the criminal justice system. We need more Indigenous justices, lawyers, police. So there's some examples, but we also need to have and deconstruct, or start from the beginning, these institutions that have seemed to be able to survive for so long, whether it be policing systems or otherwise, where the people at the top can't actually clearly identify that systemic racism exists in the first place. That's wrong. We have to ensure that we're looking at these institutions and dismantling them and rebuilding them in a way that actually is not marginalizing, discriminating, or against individuals.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, I think this is a very convincing answer, especially when you start by answering in terms of self-governance for Indigenous peoples. I think this is absolutely right. But you also mentioned, I think this is really key, it's not just Indigenous peoples who are overrepresented in criminal justice system, but other marginalized communities, racialized peoples, particularly Canadians of African descent. And of course, when we raise this question, we raise the specificity of police brutality against African people on the continent, right, in the United States especially. And this is where a very important discussion is being forwarded about the abolition of the police or defunding the police. And I think this is really key now in the context of the pandemic, isn't it? Because I mean, as Angela Davis has put it really, quite beautifully on Democracy Now! Just last fall, it's about shifting public funds to new services and new institutions, mental health counselors who can respond to people who are in crisis without arms. It's about shifting funding to education, to housing, to recreation, all those things that help to create security and safety. It's about learning that safety safeguarded by violence is not really safety, which is, I think, a really interesting kind of rejoinder to the idea that, well, we need to change, in a sense, the complexion of policing. We need to change the identities of the police officers. It's really about the whole structure, of violence that is seen to be a kind of basis for safety. So any final thoughts on that? I'd be really most appreciative.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important conversation that we need to continue to have, and we need to create safe spaces to actually have it. I think back when I was prosecutor down at 222 Main Street here in Vancouver, I was responsible for courtroom 304, and I saw a continuing cycle of Indigenous peoples, other marginalized Canadians, people suffering from mental health and addictions issues come through my courtroom like a revolving door, but there was no mechanisms at the time in place to assist these people or to stop that revolving door. We need to build those, and we need to look at, let's have a conversation about defunding the police, but what that actually means, how we can provide the necessary supports. People have called it wraparound services, enable people to have a safe roof over their head, to have an income, to be able to get the necessary treatment for their addiction issues. This is what we need to have a conversation about, to be more compassionate, to not be tough on crime, but to be, and this is Obama's language, to be smart on crime. The vast majority of people that come into the criminal justice system, particularly if they're Indigenous or from another marginalized community, don't come into that system because they're inherently criminal. They have challenges that bring them there. These are symptoms of a reality, or a disparity, or a marginalization of racism or prejudice that is imparted on them. That needs to change. And if we can look at silver linings from this COVID reality that we're living through, is that this has been highlighted more and more. I talked about this in the speech, and we're talking about it now. We need to continue to have these discussions. And as I said, everybody has a role to play. And if you're prevented from playing your role, then the community suffers. This is true in my community of Wewakai, as it's true in the downtown east side of Vancouver, as it's true broadly speaking, as a country, it's true. I went back to 304, my courtroom, when I was Minister of Justice, and I was so happy to see, and I sat in on the court with Justice Dillon. It was a specialized drug treatment court, and it was fantastic. We need more of that. We need to assist people that are having challenges, and we need to look at every person as a resource that needs to contribute back to ultimately building a better community. So these discussions are absolutely important, and don't let people that say they're not important, or say that it's radical, or say that it doesn't need to be had, to sit in on one of the discussions that I hope you are going to continue to have.
Well, thank you so much for that answer and for all of your answers, and of course the wonderful speech that you gave. I think, honestly, this is one of the best sessions that I've hosted at the Institute over about 11 years now. So thank you for being here with us. It's a tremendous honor for us to have you, and it's been a really rich and insightful discussion. I'd like to thank Sven for being present, for helping to organize this, and for your terrific comments and questions, Sven, in your introduction of Jody. Thank you to all of you in the audience for being here. Also, your questions and comments were phenomenal, and they helped to make this such a great session. A final thank you to Devin Gillen, who is our videographer, so to speak. He's doing the recording and will do the post-production. That will be up within about a month, so please share that with your friends and family and colleagues. A thank you also to Huyen Pham for all the work she does as a program assistant at the Institute. We wouldn't be able to do any of this without her playing such an instrumental role. If you're interested in our future events, of which there will be many to come, especially hopefully a town hall on policing this fall, please stay tuned. Take a look at our website, social media. We have a pretty decent presence. So with that, I'll bid you all a good night. Thank you again, Jody. Sven, good to see you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
We're looking forward
Thanks,
to your
everybody.
Absolutely are. Yeah. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
book.
Thank you.